5 square miles of what are Inca ruins dating back several centuries. Locals tell Bingham the site is called Machu Picchu.
High above the valleys of Peru, deep within the towering Andes Mountains, nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, stands a wall that continues to challenge our understanding of ancient engineering. It is a place where ordinary explanations begin to struggle against extraordinary evidence. The stones are enormous, some reaching the size of automobiles, with the largest weighing more than 120 tons. To imagine their scale, picture dozens of modern cars compressed into a single block of solid stone, then lifted, shaped, and placed with a level of precision that seems almost impossible for the ancient world. But the true mystery is not only their size, it is the way these massive stones fit together. At the points where one enormous block meets another, the joints are so precise that even after centuries of earthquakes and natural forces, the gaps remain almost impossibly narrow. There is no visible mortar, no cement, no filler holding them together. The stones simply lock into one another, pressed together with such accuracy that many visitors describe the walls as appearing almost seamless. After more than 500 years of seismic activity in one of the most unstable regions on Earth, these ancient structures still stand. For generations, the ruins scattered throughout the Peruvian highlands have been placed among the greatest architectural mysteries in human history, often mentioned alongside monuments like Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza. They represent one of archaeology's most fascinating questions. How did ancient builders, working with limited technology, create structures of such scale, complexity, and durability? In recent years, researchers have begun applying new technologies to these ancient sites. High-resolution scans, satellite imagery, digital modeling, and advanced computational analysis have allowed scientists to examine these monuments in ways that earlier generations never could. Some researchers have even explored how artificial intelligence might analyze thousands of measurements, images, and geological records to identify patterns hidden within the ruins. The machine was not given a conclusion in advance. It was not asked to prove an existing theory or defend a historical interpretation. Instead, the idea was simple: examine the evidence, compare the data, and ask the fundamental question that has fascinated historians for centuries: who built these places and how? The answer, regardless of the debate surrounding it, forces us to look more closely at one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas and at the mysteries that still surround their achievements. The site at the center of this discussion is Sacsayhuaman, a massive stone complex overlooking the ancient Inca capital of Cusco. According to the traditional archaeological view, the fortress-like structure was built by the Inca during the height of their empire in the 15th century. The Inca were extraordinary engineers, architects, and organizers. At their peak, they controlled a vast territory stretching across much of western South America, connected by an enormous network of roads, bridges, and settlements. Building Sacsayhuaman would have required an immense workforce. Thousands of laborers would have been needed to quarry, transport, shape, and position the massive stones. The process would have demanded years of planning, coordination, and extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet the stones themselves are what make the site so remarkable. Unlike simple rectangular blocks stacked in straight rows, many of the stones at Sacsayhuaman are complex polygonal shapes. Some contain multiple sides and unusual angles, each carefully carved to fit perfectly against the stones surrounding them. The result resembles a giant three-dimensional puzzle, where every piece has a unique shape and purpose. Creating such a wall requires more than simply moving heavy rocks into position. Each stone must be carefully shaped to match the exact contours of its neighbors. A small mistake could create instability, but the builders achieved a level of precision that continues to impress modern observers. And they accomplished this without the use of modern machinery, steel tools, or advanced construction equipment. The exact methods remain a subject of discussion among researchers, with many questions still surrounding the techniques used to quarry, transport, and shape these enormous blocks. The challenge becomes even greater when we consider the environment where these structures were built. The Andes are among the most geologically active regions on Earth. The mountains exist along a major tectonic boundary where enormous sections of the Earth's crust interact, producing frequent earthquakes. In such an environment, traditional buildings often suffer severe damage over time. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century and built colonial structures in Cusco, many of their buildings were constructed using European architectural methods of the era. However, repeated earthquakes damaged and destroyed many of those colonial structures. The ancient stone walls, however, endured. Their survival was not simply a matter of luck. The irregular shapes of the stones created a flexible structure capable of absorbing seismic energy. Instead of cracking apart like rigid masonry, the stones could shift slightly during an earthquake and settle back into position afterward. What appears visually chaotic is actually a highly sophisticated engineering solution. The polygonal design was not merely decorative. It was a form of earthquake-resistant construction that modern engineers only began studying more deeply in recent times. But the deeper researchers examine these sites, the more complicated the timeline becomes. Approximately 40 miles from Cusco, within the dramatic landscape of the Sacred Valley, lies another ancient site that presents an equally fascinating mystery: Ollantaytambo. Built high in the Andes at roughly 9,200 feet above sea level, Ollantaytambo contains a series of enormous stone blocks known as the Temple of the Sun's Unfinished Wall. Among them are 6 massive pink granite monoliths arranged in a line, each weighing more than 50 tons. Their surfaces are remarkably smooth, and their edges fit together with incredible precision. Visitors often run their hands across the stone expecting a rough, weathered surface, only to discover craftsmanship that appears almost polished. But the most intriguing question about Ollantaytambo is not how these stones were shaped. It is where they came from, because the granite used in these enormous blocks did not originate beside the temple itself. It came from a quarry located several miles away, across some of the most challenging terrain imaginable: steep mountain slopes, deep valleys, and difficult river crossings. And that raises the next great mystery. How did ancient builders transport massive stones weighing dozens of tons across the Andes, and then lift them into position with such extraordinary accuracy? The granite blocks at Ollantaytambo were not simply moved a short distance across flat ground. Geologists have traced their origin to a mountainside quarry located roughly 4 miles away, but those 4 miles represent some of the most unforgiving terrain imaginable. The path between quarry and temple was not a straight road. It was a journey through steep slopes, narrow valleys, and obstacles created by the Andes themselves. To move even a single 50-ton block from that quarry, the builders would have needed to lower it down a mountain, transport it across the valley floor, somehow cross a flowing river, and then accomplish the part that seems almost impossible: lifting that same enormous mass uphill to the elevated terraces where it stands today. Try to imagine the effort required for just one stone. Now, multiply that challenge by 6 massive granite monoliths, each weighing tens of tons. Then remove the one invention that most people would assume was necessary: advanced lifting and transportation technology. This is where the traditional explanation begins to face its greatest challenges. When researchers examine the evidence for how these stones were moved, they encounter a strange absence. The tools and machines that would normally make such an operation possible do not appear in the archaeological record. There are no remains of large transport systems, no evidence of heavy lifting devices, and no clear traces of the technology that would be expected for moving such enormous weights. This missing piece is where the mystery truly begins. Consider what transporting a 50-ton granite block would require today. Modern engineers would rely on powerful machinery, hydraulic cranes capable of lifting extreme weights, reinforced vehicles designed for heavy transport, and engines producing hundreds of horsepower. Now, remove all of those tools and imagine the builders of Ollantaytambo attempting the same task thousands of years ago. The conventional explanation suggests a combination of ropes, wooden rollers, earthen ramps, and enormous numbers of workers pulling together in coordination. Human strength, careful planning, and persistence. But when examined closely, each part of that explanation raises new questions. Start with the wheel. Across the entire archaeological record of the Andes, researchers have found no clear evidence that the Inca or earlier Andean cultures used wheeled vehicles for transportation. Circular shapes existed in their art and craftsmanship, but there is no confirmed evidence of carts, axles, or roads designed for moving heavy loads on wheels. This creates an unusual contrast. The builders were capable of moving and shaping some of the largest stones ever handled in the ancient Americas. Yet the most famous mechanical advantage in human history, the wheel for transportation, does not appear to have played a role in that process. Then there is the question of lifting. To place a 50-ton stone with the accuracy seen at Ollantaytambo, the builders would have needed extraordinary control. The stone could not simply be dragged into position. It had to be lowered, adjusted, and fitted so precisely that the surrounding blocks met almost perfectly. Modern construction would require cranes, lifting platforms, pulleys, counterweights, and carefully engineered support systems. Yet the archaeological evidence does not reveal anything comparable from the period. Some reconstructions have proposed wooden frames, levers, and ramps, but the challenge remains enormous. Supporting and controlling the movement of dozens of tons of granite with basic wooden structures would have required an extraordinary level of engineering and coordination. And then comes another limitation: animals. Many ancient civilizations relied heavily on powerful animals for construction. Egypt used oxen and other labor animals to move materials. Rome developed massive systems of transportation and engineering. Across Asia, elephants and draft animals played major roles in large-scale construction. The Andes were different. The largest domesticated animal available to Andean societies was the llama. These remarkable animals were perfectly adapted to mountain environments, but they were not designed for moving enormous loads. A llama could carry only a limited amount of weight, usually measured in tens of kilograms, not tons. A 50-ton monolith could not be attached to a single llama. It could not be solved by simply adding dozens or even hundreds of them. The mathematics of the problem remains unchanged, which leaves human labor as the primary explanation. And even if thousands of workers were organized, supplied, and coordinated across miles of difficult terrain, the challenges would still remain. The stone had to be controlled while descending steep slopes. It had to cross unpredictable landscapes. It had to be pulled uphill against gravity without sliding backward and endangering everyone involved. Every serious attempt to reconstruct the process eventually reaches the same difficult conclusion. The exact method remains uncertain. But moving the stone is only one part of the mystery. Before those massive blocks ever reached the temple, they first had to be extracted from the quarry and shaped into their final forms, and this is where the puzzle becomes even more complex. The stones used in many of these ancient sites were not soft materials. They were composed of extremely hard volcanic rocks, such as andesite and diorite, among the toughest natural stones encountered in ancient construction. Geologists measure mineral hardness using the Mohs scale. On this scale, a human fingernail measures around 2.5, while ordinary glass is around 5.5. Andesite and diorite can reach around 7, sometimes approaching 8, placing them close to the hardness of quartz and some gemstones. Now consider the tools available to ancient Andean builders. Their known metal tools were primarily made from copper and bronze. Copper measures around 3 on the Mohs scale, while bronze varies but generally remains significantly softer than these hard volcanic stones. The contrast is striking. A tool with a hardness rating around 3 was being used to shape a material approaching 8. To understand the challenge, imagine taking a granite countertop in your kitchen and trying to carve a perfectly straight angle into it using a plastic spoon. Not simply scratching the surface, not creating a small mark, but carving precise, repeated shapes across dozens of enormous stone blocks. The spoon would deform long before the granite changed. That comparison captures the basic engineering problem. A softer material was somehow used to shape a much harder one on a massive scale, producing results that continue to challenge modern observers. Researchers have attempted to recreate these techniques using replica bronze tools under controlled conditions. The results can create scratches, rough marks, and uneven damage on stone surfaces. But what they struggle to reproduce are the features seen in the ancient walls, the incredibly smooth faces, the sharp interlocking angles, and the carefully fitted curves that appear throughout these monuments. And this is the detail that drew the greatest attention. Not only the size of the stones, not only the difficulty of transporting them, the finish itself. Because when you stop asking how these stones were moved and start asking how they were shaped, the mystery enters an entirely different territory. The question is no longer about strength or manpower. It becomes a question of precision, a level of craftsmanship that appears less like a construction site on a mountain and more like the work of a highly advanced workshop. The angles are remarkably accurate. The surfaces are unusually smooth and flat, measurable with modern tools. But it is the joints between the stones that continue to capture the attention of engineers and researchers. Deep within the ancient walls of Cusco, there is one particular stone that has become an icon of this mystery. It contains 12 separate angles, each one carefully shaped to meet the surrounding stones. Instead of behaving like individual blocks placed beside one another, the entire wall functions almost like a single connected structure. For more than 5 centuries, this stone has endured the violent earthquakes that have repeatedly struck the Andes. Yet it remains in place, unmoved and intact. It has become one of the most photographed examples of ancient stonework in the world, and despite centuries of study, the exact techniques used to create it remain a subject of debate. It was this combination of geometry, precision, and unexplained craftsmanship that led researchers to examine the ruins from a completely different perspective. Instead of relying only on traditional interpretations, they began analyzing the physical evidence itself, the stone surfaces, the tool marks, and the microscopic details left behind by the builders. They began with the surfaces because the surfaces are where the story of human craftsmanship should be written most clearly. When archaeologists study ancient stonework created by hand, they usually expect to find a recognizable pattern. Under carefully angled lighting, known as raking light, every small imperfection becomes visible. The surface reveals the movement of the craftsman's hand, repeated strikes, slight changes in direction, and overlapping marks where tools were repositioned again and again. Ancient stone can preserve a history of labor. Like footprints preserved in snow, tool marks reveal the process that created them. But on some of the finest examples of Andean stonework, those expected signatures are difficult to find. Instead of visible layers of hammering and cutting, certain surfaces appear remarkably smooth, almost as if the stone had somehow been shaped into that form before hardening. And where marks do exist, especially at Sacsayhuaman, they do not always resemble the sharp cuts normally produced by traditional chisels. A chisel removes material through impact, leaving behind recognizable edges and angular scars. Some surfaces, however, display something different. rounded depressions and curved impressions that appear smoother than typical impact marks. They resemble shallow scoops rather than cuts, as though the stone had been shaped by pressure or abrasion rather than simple striking. These unusual details represent one of the most intriguing aspects of the mystery, because the greatest question may not be how large the stones are. It may not even be how far they were transported. The deeper question is how the builders achieved such a refined surface finish with the tools available to them. Stone is not naturally cooperative. It has internal weaknesses, hidden fractures, and unpredictable patterns. When force is applied, it often breaks according to those natural structures. Creating smooth curves and perfectly fitted surfaces requires not only strength, but control. To make stone behave almost like a softer material would require techniques capable of overcoming the natural resistance of the rock itself. Some theories have suggested possibilities ranging from specialized grinding methods to unknown ancient techniques, while others point toward traditional explanations involving patient craftsmanship over long periods of time. But the exact process remains one of the great unanswered questions surrounding these monuments. And then there is another fascinating piece of the puzzle: what the Inca themselves said about these ancient walls. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century and encountered the massive stone structures of Cusco, they naturally asked the people living there who had built them. According to accounts recorded by Spanish chroniclers, the answer they received was not a claim of ownership. The Inca did not simply say, "Our ancestors built this." Instead, many traditions attributed these ancient works to the Viracochas, legendary beings or ancestors believed to have existed before the Inca and to have played a role in shaping the world. This detail has fascinated historians for centuries. The Inca were one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. They created an enormous empire, developed complex agricultural systems, built thousands of miles of roads, and produced remarkable architecture of their own. Yet when confronted with some of the most impressive stonework on the continent, they looked backward rather than claiming full credit. They pointed toward an older memory. Whether this represents historical truth, mythology, or a combination of both remains debated. But it reveals something important. Even the people who inherited these landscapes recognized that some of the monuments belong to a much older tradition. And when researchers examine Sacsayhuaman closely today, another pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The site appears to contain evidence of different construction phases. At the lower foundations are the enormous polygonal stones, the massive blocks with complex angles, incredible precision, and carefully fitted joints. Above them are later layers of construction featuring smaller, more regular stones, often fitted with different techniques and materials. The contrast is striking. The lower sections appear monumental and highly engineered. The upper sections appear more conventional. It creates the impression of two different approaches existing within the same structure. One based on massive precision stonework, and another based on more familiar construction methods. Traditional archaeology generally explains this as the work of different periods within the Inca era, with later modifications and additions made over time. But the contrast has also inspired alternative interpretations, suggesting that later builders may have inherited and adapted much older foundations. This is where advanced analysis enters the discussion. The goal was not to begin with a conclusion. The goal was to examine the evidence without assumptions. A human researcher approaches a site with years of education, previous studies, accepted theories, and historical frameworks already in mind. Those tools are valuable, but they can also influence the questions being asked. A machine has no personal investment in a particular answer. It has no academic reputation to protect, no career connected to a theory, and no desire for one explanation over another. So researchers gathered enormous amounts of information and presented it with one simple question: what patterns are actually present? And the data they provided was extensive. They included everything from detailed laser scans and satellite imagery to geological surveys, measurements, photographs, and digital models. Every visible feature that could be recorded was transformed into information that could be compared, analyzed, and studied from a completely new perspective. Because in order to understand the true story of these stones, the researchers believed they first had to examine the entire picture, not just one wall, one site, or one civilization, but the complete network of ancient structures spread throughout the Andes. The next stage of the analysis focused on bringing together every piece of information available about these ancient structures. The researchers began by feeding the system LIDAR data, laser scans capable of cutting through vegetation, soil, and surface layers to reveal the raw geometry of the ruins. Every edge, every angle, every curve of every stone could be measured down to the smallest details. Then came satellite imagery. From above, the landscape revealed patterns that are almost impossible to notice from the ground. The locations of different sites, their relationship to mountains, valleys, rivers, and ancient pathways all became part of a much larger picture. Ground-penetrating radar added another layer. Beneath the visible stones were hidden foundations, buried chambers, and structures that had remained untouched for centuries. The technology allowed researchers to examine what existed below the surface, the unseen architecture beneath the ruins. The system was then given geological information. Surveys of rock formations, quarry locations, and mineral compositions allowed it to trace the origins of individual stones, following their journey from the mountainsides where they were extracted to the places where they were eventually placed. Astronomical measurements were added as well. Ancient alignments connected to solstices, equinoxes, and celestial events were included, revealing how these structures interacted with the movements of the sky and the changing positions of stars over thousands of years. Finally came the photographs. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of high-resolution images collected from across the Andes. Every wall, every doorway, every carved surface, every unusual stone arrangement that researchers had documented was added into one massive database. The goal was not to examine one monument in isolation, it was to compare everything at once, every site, every structure, every pattern, allowing the system to search for connections that a human researcher might overlook. And when the analysis was complete, the first discovery was not about a single wall. It was about all of them. The machine identified what appeared to be a repeating architectural signature, a collection of shared design patterns appearing across ancient sites separated by hundreds of miles of difficult Andean terrain. Distances that would have taken ancient travelers weeks to cross. Across these locations, the same unusual features appeared again and again. The same polygonal stone arrangements, the same complex, interlocking geometry, the same slight inward angle of the walls designed for stability, and the same unusual shaping techniques visible on certain stone surfaces.